All right, so today we are going to talk about Drupal deployments with Ansible. And oftentimes deploying Drupal can often seem like this assembly line building this car. There are a lot of very detailed steps that all have to be done in the right order. And if you don't get them all right, you end up with a broken car. So we build a tool to help solve that. And we have a repo that many of you might not know about. It is called Ansible Deploy Drupal. It's within the Chromatic HQ organization, but it's public. And it is an Ansible role that manages the deployment of Drupal to a web server. What is it? Well, we kind of already started talking about that. But it automates all the steps to get Drupal onto a server and allows you to configure them. Why did we create it? Well, many reasons. We often had shell scripts all over the place, multiple ones in a repo, some for QA, some for prod, maybe a local deployment variation, and they vary by repo. This put it all in one spot, and we know what we're working with. And we wanted to keep things organized and uniform across sites. So this allows us to standardize it, so we always know that we're following the exact same set of steps, whether we're deploying one client or another client site, and we can have confidence that the same process is being followed. And it's often hard to remember what those steps are. If we didn't have this tool, we'd have to be writing shell scripts or some other pasting commands into a Jenkins command execution thing that's not even version controlled. And this allows us to not have to remember what all those steps are, what their order is, or the why. So it's really great to have this all in one spot documented because it's easy to forget. And it makes setting up QA simple. If we have an existing site or a new site and we want to set up Tugboat or some other QA tool, it's super easy to mimic how we've deployed a production in the same way we deployed a QA with this tool. And it also gives us visibility into changes in the deployment process. Whenever we want to add a step, remove a step, change how something is done, there's a pull request into this repository, and we get to see it and discuss it. And sharing is caring. If you find a bug in the deployment process of one site, it gets fixed here, and it goes out to all the other sites that use this tool as well. So it's not just you find a bug and you say, oh, next week when I'm not so busy, I'll share this with everyone else, because that never happens, right? So this helps us with that. So why did we choose Ansible to automate our deployments? Well, Ansible has no dependencies. If you can SSH into a box, Ansible can connect to it and act on that box. So that made it super easy and a low barrier to entry. We write all of our Ansible stuff in YAML, and we like YAML. So that's a pro right there. Ansible has a lot of open source roles that help support any functionality you write with it. So you can do all sorts of complex stuff with the Ansible Galaxy plugin system. So we don't use too many of those with this because it's fairly straightforward. But if we needed to add functionality in the future, it's easy to add that on and share this with others too. Ansible also has a great system for providing defaults, but allowing really good configurability with those, which is great for a tool like this where we want to be opinionated because we think we have a best practice, but we also want to allow people to configure it as needed and not be draconian and our way is the only way this tool will work. Ansible is idempotent, so it only takes action when needed, and it always ends up with the same result no matter how many times it's ran, which is a great thing to build confidence in a deployment process. You always know you're going to get the same thing, and you can run it again and again and not be worried about it breaking something. So what does this tool do? What's going on underneath the hood? First of all, it clones the specified repository to the server if you tell it to, and get your code there. So that's a good first step. It can run drush site install. So if you don't have a database yet, you're starting on a new site, it can scaffold everything up and get you going and check your code even without a database. But that's configurable. So if you do have a database and you want to run the standard deployment commands as codified in drush deploy, update config, import config, clear your caches, etc., you can run that as well. And that's the default. But of course, you can adjust that. Chmod and chown, it will fix and set all the file directory permissions for you using sensible defaults. But again, you can configure this as needed. This is super valuable as it's very easy to forget, and I couldn't even tell you offhand what directories need what permissions, but we've understood it at one point and we codified it, and now it's super easy to leverage this every time we use this tool. Composer install. It installs your composer dependencies, and it's pretty straightforward. But again, you can turn that on and off. So say you're trying to deploy something that's already built, a fully built artifact, and you don't need this. You can turn this on or off. Same with this. While it doesn't exclusively build with Yarn, you can build your theme files. So you just give it the command you want to run to build your theme files, and away you go. And again, this is optional. And one of the latest features of it is configuration accountability. During the deployment process, after it imports the Drupal configuration, it'll export the configuration and check if there's a diff. And if there's any changes that it finds, it'll fail the build. So that keeps us accountable that we're committing all of the configuration and keeping it in sync. And again, we can turn this on or off, as you probably only want to use this in a QA environment. You never want to fail a production build for something like this. So now that we know what it does, how can you use it? Many of our repositories already have this set up, but if anyone else wants to use it, or we were adding this to a new site, let's look at the steps. So in an Ansible folder, we just stick it in there for organization. We create a requirements file that tells Ansible which roles we need to include when we run it. So here we give it the name of the package or the playbook, and we tell it which version we want to use. You could also point it to a branch if you want to use some new feature that maybe hasn't been released yet. We set up our host file, which is the Ansible convention, and we can tell it about our QA environment, our production environment, and all the different environments we may want to run against. Next, we configure our playbook. So we tell it where is our code on the server, what command, do we want to flush Redis? Do we want to build the theme? Do we want to do a configuration check? So here you can see, some of those defaults being overridden and set. Fairly straightforward, and not a whole lot that you have to do to get it set up. So finally, and whatever you're running your deployment script, you put this command there. You give it the limit, and you give it the path to all the different host file, the configuration, and you run it. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And of course, this will generate a whole bunch of output, and you can set timers on this and do all sorts of anything you can do with an Ansible run. But that's another topic. And with that, your deployment is complete. And hopefully it was successful for those of you that understand this. And for additional reading, you can check out a blog post I wrote on this Ansible tool, and also a blog post that goes more in depth on the configuration checking bit. Questions?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Longtime fan. Thanks, Adam. How do you go about, or how have you gone about figuring out what each like task does? I've found often when I'm like, okay, here's a playbook and this line says it's going to do something, but I don't know what it's actually doing. Do you understand what I mean? Like, where do I actually, like I've gone into the subfolders, looking at tasks, main.yml, saying, oh, this doesn't seem to tell me what's actually happening. Like, I find the abstraction is sometimes confusing because I don't get down to the part that I want to see what's actually, what the commands are being run on the server at that time for that step.
So yeah, I mean, so Ansible has, can just execute a shell command directly, which is what we do for when we run the drush commands. So I assume that's not what you're talking about, because that's pretty straightforward, right? You're talking about maybe like when we change the owners of a directory or do something like that with an Ansible plugin. Mark, correct me if I'm using the wrong terminology.
Yeah, so like an Ansible module, I think is what you're referring to. And there's a lot of built-in functionality like an Ansible core. So I think I don't know if this answers your question, but I think the most important thing to understand, and Adam alluded to this about Ansible, is that in our Ansible roles or in a playbook, we're describing the end state. So that goes with the idempotentness of Ansible. So we're not telling Ansible, in most cases, what to do. We're telling it the state we want to achieve. And then if some action is necessary to achieve that state, then Ansible is taking that action. So for example, when we describe like file permissions, we're telling it what file permissions we want a file or a folder to be set to. We're not telling it change these file permissions. We're telling it the state that we want to achieve, and Ansible checks, and if it doesn't match that state, then it will take action to change the file permissions to match that. So I think you're kind of, if that doesn't answer your question, then I think you're asking like, well, I want to see it actually like run the the file permission commands and see those. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that was a good explanation. I like just the fact that that eluded me, that we just say, this is the state we want it to be in Ansible. You're so smart, you're going to do it for us. Thanks. But you don't really have to know how it does it.
Yeah, and I would also say that the Ansible documentation is very thorough. So, I'm frequently looking at the Ansible documentation for like, well, what are all the, here's this file permissions module, quote unquote, in Ansible, like what does it support? Like, how do I tell it what state we want? So Ansible can, via the shell or I forget the other command, you can kind of like bypass Ansible module and say like, just run this command. And sometimes we have to do that for things that aren't built into Ansible. And those things are going to just run. So it's not super Ansible-y, we'll call it. But we do that along with like conditionals, like the when clause there and things like that. But yeah, if you look up pull up where we chain, so right there on line 131, for instance, we use the file module. And then, through line 136, you see all those different options: path, state, owner, group, mode. In the Ansible documentation, it's very descriptive, telling you all of those different options and others. I think it's that second link. Nope, maybe the third link. There you go. So there, like all the parameters that you can pass in to set different states. Also, as many people have probably noticed when they're trying to look at Ansible output in various places, Ansible can give you very verbose output if you ask for it. So if you're looking for more detail, add an extra -v or 2 to your command or the command that's running, and you'll get more output. I don't know if it's going to be exactly what you're looking for, but there's a good chance there's relevant and useful data in there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Nope. Well,
Thank you, Adam.
yeah. Hopefully this was helpful for everyone, because I know this was a black box of how this all worked for a while until I dove in. So hopefully that helps others avoid that confusion.